hello. Hope you're having a good conference so far. Right. Compliance. It's always a fun topic. So I guess a lot of you come here for a little bit of a nap. So it's something that's quite close to my heart, having worked in 3 or 4 big roles, dealing with things like PCI DSS, Sarbanes-Oxley, data protection, so on and so forth. And it's something that I've had to do an awful lot of work for. And a lot of people think it's a big, nasty monster that it's not. So, compliance, what is it and how sort of could affect you and me, and so on and so forth. So, the objective of this is really just to run you through 3 of the big compliance areas, and then just sort of ways to look at it and ways to look at doing things. So, me. I'm John. I currently work for a company called H-Tech in Southampton. We do credit card processing and so on and so forth. So we're sort of level 1 PCI accredited, dealing with millions of transactions as a payment processor. So we've got PCI auditing on an annual basis. External auditors come in, pen tests, you name it. 2 weeks of lots of questions and lots of paperwork. I've been working with SQL Server for just over 6 years now. DBA, BI, you name it, pretty much done it. Currently in a BI role, doing a big platform uplift. I also run the Southampton user group, which is a past chapter down on the south coast of England. So if you're ever there and we've got a user group, feel free to drop past. And if anyone's got any questions about anything, my email address is up there. I believe the slides will be going out. So feel free to drop me an email. More than happy to answer questions if I can. If I can't, I'll let you know. I'll go look it up. So what are we going to be covering? What is compliance? A few places I've worked, the compliance banner has been waved around, and a lot of people have got very sort of skewed ideas of just what compliance is, how you need to meet it, and what you need to do, and the scope, and so on and so forth. There's various different areas of it. Some of it is legislation from governments. So things like Sarbanes-Oxley from the US is a legislation. Data Protection Act here in Europe and in the UK is legislation as well, so you can end up getting fined and so on and so forth, and you can go through the various bodies. There's also various industry regulations as well, such as PCI DSS, which is put together by people like Visa, Mastercard, and other payment providers. Why you should be interested in it? Especially something I'm seeing now is the big implementations of BI systems, customer data, and that means personal details, credit cards, and so on and so forth. Protecting that information is sort of becoming a bit of a differentiator. You think the likes of Sony PlayStation Network that got done over, there was a lot of customer data in there that was potentially exposed. You get a big breach like that, it's going to knock trust. And when there's a lot of people and there's a lot of fierce competition in the marketplace, if you're operating in, that trust that customers can have in you, that you're going to protect their data and their information, can look to set you apart from other people in your marketplace. Well, that's my personal viewpoint, and in sort of to the level of my experience as well in one of the industries I've worked through. What can we do to meet it? There's various different things, ranging from process, procedure, and documentation, 3 things we all love, through to actually hard technology sort of implementations that you can use to monitor systems and so on and so forth. And we'll also cover some sort of tips and tricks that I've put in place to make life a little bit easier for myself, so that you don't have to do the same thing every year, spend 2 weeks rushing around like a headless chicken. You've just got a big folder of paperwork that you can give to an external auditor, and they come in and they can just ask fewer questions, and you've got better answers for them. And we'll go from there. So what is compliance? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary has it the action of complying with a wish or command, which essentially is, in our environment, an audit trail saying what we do, how we do it. And documenting that is one of the cornerstones of compliance I've found. It's also something that a lot of people, as I say, get very wound up about and think it is something that's going to cause them a huge amount of work, and there's a lot of stress. So, hopefully this will sort of help dispel some of that, and we'll go from there. The 3 main areas, as I touched on earlier, that I'll be covering as part of this presentation are PCI DSS, which is Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. So that's where you're taking and processing credit card payments. There's a number of different levels, and we'll cover those in a bit. There's also something called PA DSS, which if you're developing applications to take payment, so point of sale, that sort of thing, the PA DSS is something that will apply. It's not something we'll cover here. SOX, or Sarbanes-Oxley, came in the aftermath of Enron, where people were cooking the books, It's a big sort of risk analysis, risk mitigation compliance area. It's very, very verbose. It was written by politicians and lawyers, so you can imagine what it is trying to figure out just what you need to do to meet it. A lot of it is guesswork, but an awful lot of it is common sense. And then we'll cover some of the areas of data protection. My experience has been with the UK Data Protection Act, but a lot of the things that they ask you to do are fundamental common sense that if it was my data, this is what I'd expect people to be doing with it and how to look after it. So, in addition to that, there's also various other things like HIPAA, you've got ISO, various other compliances, and a lot of the things that we'll talk about in this one, there's an awful lot of crossover. So once you're sort of compliant in one area, it's going to sort of carry through, and you should be you should find it very easy to then transition into, say, something like ISO 27001 if you're already doing Sarbanes-Oxley, because a lot of that, again, is risk mitigation and risk compliance. So, PCI DSS. PCI DSS is an industry regulation. So it's been set up by people like Visa, Mastercard, and the other big payment providers, enforced by them and the banks. It's an insurance policy for them, essentially, to say, you say you're compliant with PCI DSS, and in which case we will cover you if you are found to be compliant, if you have a breach. There's insurance in place for that sort of thing. However, if you're not compliant, you're on your own. It is a very prescriptive compliance and very prescriptive standard. Essentially, there is a big document you can download from the PCI DSS website, and it is essentially a tick list of, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And we'll cover some of those things in a bit. I've got a couple of images there that will show you just how prescriptive it is at a very high level. There are two main different certification methods. For the smaller merchants and smaller vendors, you're looking essentially at being self-certified. So one of the places I worked, we were at level 4, verging on level 3. And we had our CIO and IT director were the ones that basically helped us sort of go to the banks and say, yep, we are self-certifying ourselves as PCI compliant. So we didn't have external auditors coming in. And that meant the banks would still handle our payments for us and handle our payment processing. Tier 2, there's a bit of a grey area. You could look at external auditors coming in or self-certification. Level 1 is external auditors coming in, doing penetration testing, looking at your process procedures, looking for common sort of security mistakes during system configurations. Back when SQL Server 2000 was still a technically supported platform, we were still looking for things like blank passwords being put in and the right service pack being in place. Now that 2000's completely out of scope, they won't look at it. If you've got 2000 on premises, then you better have a very good compensating control explaining why you've got it there. As I said, it was set up by Visa and Mastercard with other payment card providers, so JCB, Amex, and so on and so forth got on board as well when they realized that it was a better way to sort of manage how people were handling the data with regards to credit cards and minimizing their risk, so that if the credit card data got out and about, for example, if someone gets your credit card information, the credit card companies will reimburse you most of the time, so long as you can prove that you didn't leave it lying on the side somewhere and it got taken and so on and so forth. It's much the same when it comes to those merchants as well. If you can prove you've protected the data, then they'll help you out. As I say, it's applicable to those processing credit cards now. There's two different ways of looking at it. You've got the e-commerce side of things. So if you've got a website and you're processing payments through that directly, so you're taking the credit card data through your systems rather than, say, using PayPal, there's a certain level that you can reach, and then you move up through the levels. For the big tier 1 and tier 2, it's irrespective of which channel you're taking it. So if you're taking direct credit card payments through your stores and through your website and through a call center, doesn't matter which channel that you're receiving those payments through, if they all total past a certain number, then you're within that boundary, and that's where you need to look at making sure you are compliant. As I say, there are different levels of compliance. Starting level 4, which is the lowest, rather than level 1. Level 4 is essentially 20,000 e-commerce transactions through Visa. And for all other merchants, you're looking anything up to 1 million Visa transactions per year, effectively. A level 3 merchant, you're looking, again, between 20,000 and 1 million Visa e-commerce transactions per year. Level 2 is between 1 million and 6 million transactions, so payment transactions coming through your systems. And that's where it comes into the point of, it doesn't matter which channel you're receiving those payments through. If they if they're between 1 million and 6 million, then you're there. Greater than 6 million, you're level 1, and that's when you've really got to be on the ball with your compliance. So here we go. Looking at this is PCI DSS. Just what data is sort of falling under PCI DSS. It's essentially all of the information you have on your card. So the PAN, or the primary account number, the big long one across the front of the card. You can store it, and there's a couple of different ways you can look at making sure that you've got it in a non-readable form. If you have got to have it so you can pull it back out of the system for, say, call center operators to read it, then you're going to have to encrypt it. That's reversible, which means you've then all got the key management that goes with that. Then there's also something known as truncation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with as data professionals, but it's where you remove a portion of the PAN and render it completely irreversible and unreadable, at which point a lot of your PCI requirement goes away because there's no way of reconstructing that. So typically you're looking at the first 6 numbers and the last 4 numbers of the card number. If the bit in between is completely truncated and you cannot get it back, then you're safe. The cardholder name is also considered PCI DSS data, and again, you can store it, and you can store it in plain text. Service code and the expiry date, again, they're all information that you might want to keep, and you don't have to encrypt them. There's also the sensitive data itself, and this is where you're dealing with the little applications and such like that, where you're swiping the data and so on and so forth, taking the PIN information. You cannot store it unless you're under certain circumstances, in that you're assisting payment providers or the actual payment industry themselves, and you've got to perform certain actions, but they need to be fully documented as to why you are storing this information. If an external auditor comes in, finds out you're storing any of this information whatsoever, you will fail your audit straight away. It is very difficult to explain why you're likely to need that information. So those are all the bits and pieces that you see. There's the CAV2, CVC, whatever it is. That's the little number on the back of the credit, on the signature strip, or the full number one on Amex. And like I say, you're not allowed to store any of that at all. One of the things to remember about that is also, whilst you might not intentionally store it, whether or not you are unintentionally storing it through application logs, diagnostic queries and stuff like that. If you're doing deep packet inspection on your network and so on and so forth, and that's getting logged somewhere, how's the traffic going across your network? Is that encrypted, or is that running plain text? So you could inadvertently bring your monitoring systems into scope. The same as if you've got a call center and they're taking details over the phone. A lot of the times you'll hear hold 1 second whilst I turn the recording system off, because they don't want to bring their entire sort of phone management system into the PCI scope. And scope is something that's very, very important. And we'll cover that in a bit as well. Making it as small as possible makes your life a lot easier. As I said, PCI DSS is very, very prescriptive. This is just an example. There's the 12 main areas about things that you'll need to do. A lot of them, like I said earlier, are common sense. So installing and maintaining firewalls on your systems, network, computer, servers, between your VLANs, not using vendor defaults, so you're not going to use the sort of standard Dell user interface, username and password for their management console, so on and so forth. You're not going to use default passwords from Cisco on your switches or your routers and so on and so forth. Protecting the stored data, that can range from it's in a locked cupboard that nobody can get to unless they sign the key out and so on and so forth, all the way through to TDE, backup encryption, so on and so forth. Everything's stored there. It also covers backup and restore. So you've got to prove that you're actually making sure that you back that data up, so that in the event of there being a major system outage, you've got it to bring back as well. So there's many facets to the protection of that data. Encrypting the transmission. Now, a lot of places, and one myself included, we offload our TCP. We stop encrypting when it hits our systems. It comes through our through our firewalls into our application, and that's where the authentication is, because we've got a secure network segment that we're working on. There are some places I've seen that they encrypt the traffic all the way back to the database server, and that way it reduces the scope further. None of the monitoring tools are in place, and so on and so forth. So that makes life a lot easier. Restricting access physically and through your application. very, very important. Okay, nobody can read it through the application, but if they can walk into the cupboard and pull the hard drive out with all of the data on, there. So you're looking at many different controls there. One of the things it does say to do as well, that, and this is where something I mentioned earlier, compensating control, where you say, I'm not doing it because, it's very prescriptive and says you must install antivirus software everywhere, including your SQL servers, which, if you set it up right, is okay, but as we know, there are some things that don't play well. So that's something where the very prescriptive nature of it, written by people not in the industry, can have an impact on the way you do your systems and your infrastructure setup. And that's something we'll cover a little bit later as well. And policy is something that you really need to look at. There's an awful lot of process and procedure and written down policies about what you do in the event of X. That goes hand in hand with a lot of the technology requirements for monitoring, securing, and maintaining the systems. So one of the things we maintain where I am at the moment is effectively a process that is written down in a playbook that says, if we are breached, we do this, and we do it to the letter. And that way, you've got a very firm process in place that says, okay, we've had an issue, it's been reported to us, we're now dealing with this, these are the actions, and this is the documentation to say that these are the remedial actions that we've done, we've notified the appropriate authorities, and so on and so forth. That's one piece of documentation that we maintain and we're very, very hot on. And it's something that I recommend that everybody looks at, much like you would have a playbook for an event of your main data center goes down and so on and so forth. How do you bring your secondary up and so on? Okay, and that's PCI DSS. Has anyone got any questions so far? Awesome. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. We'll quickly run through SOX and we'll quickly run through a couple of other bits and then we'll get on to sort of ways to look at it and what we're going to protect. SOX is a process and policy-driven system. As I said, it was written by lawyers and politicians, which means it is very open to interpretation. There is no hard and fast mechanism for getting SOX compliant. To give you an example, we had a very large, well-renowned auditing company come in to audit one of my previous employers, and they couldn't agree between themselves as to whether or not we met the compliance standard. There were 4 of them, 3 of them said we didn't, but luckily for us, the guy who said we did was the senior team member. So yeah, even then, you've got people who are doing this day in, day out, can interpret the data that you've given them, the information you've given them, and your process and policy, can interpret it in very different ways, even when they're working on the same team and they do it day in, day out themselves. Which is where making sure you've got very clear documentation, clear tests, very, very important. And also striking up a very good relationship with your auditors is very important. Taking the senior guy out for lunch really helps. So, SOX, scope, controls and tests are all defined within your business. You get to say, this is in scope. These are the tests. These are the controls. Yes, we passed them. No, we didn't. It's all down to you guys. And then when the auditors come in and they'll have a look and say, are they rigorous enough or not? So this is where defining your scope and making it as small as possible really comes into its own. So primarily SOX is looking at financial systems for risk management. So anything that can affect the worth of the business, positively or sort of adversely, is likely to fall within it. So your accountancy system, your HR system for bits and pieces. And what you're looking at is to mitigate the risk that somebody can go in and say, I'm going to give everybody a 20% pay rise behind the scenes without the appropriate controls for it being signed off by 2 or 3 different areas of the business. So it comes down to segregation of duties as well, that the HR person using the system has to have the appropriate sign-off before they can make the changes and so on and so forth. How do you implement that? Is it a paper-based system? Is it a workflow-based system like, say, SharePoint and such like? And how you document that and how you go about doing it, it is all down to you guys. It's something we spent 6 to 9 months on becoming compliant, and we were only a 30 million turnover company at that point. We'd just been bought by a very, very large American multinational, and they were like, you will now be SOX compliant. Okay, this will be fun. As I say, it's aimed at managing risk for financial systems. So not just your order system, it can be your HR system, because the liability that the company faces for, say, your pension, your salaries, any bonuses and stuff like that are all likely to affect the worth of the company and are likely to fall in scope. So, as I said, Sarbanes-Oxley, you get to define the control. So, for example, we had a system whereby we would receive an input file from one of our suppliers with regards to the value of how much their line item price was that we would then load into our Sage accounting system. So we then ended up defining the control that says we will receive it to a secure FTP server. These are the people that have access to it, and they will have a look at it. They will move it into the buyers will basically take it, and they will look it over, and they will give it the okay, and then they will put it into a directory that is then imported automatically by the system. It goes in yada, 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 and on we go. We define the tests, which essentially meant that we put monitoring onto the SFTP server, monitoring onto the directory, and then we also had a little bit of stuff added to one of the applications that we had built around our import mechanism that said, this person said, yes, it's good to go. This person has then agreed with them. Now it can do the work. So then we ran the tests, so it was working alongside it. The process was taking place. We then applied our tests to it, and we said, right, did we say we meet all of the control criteria that we set up? Yes or no? Document the outcome. It's not always a bad thing to have a failure. And that's something to get away from, to look at. If you have a failure, you say, I've defined the control, I've defined the test, actually we didn't pass it. And then doing the gap analysis before you then redefine the control and go back through the process can be a good thing because it shows that you are doing due diligence. It shows you're actually taking it seriously to auditors when they come in. If they just come in and see a big list of ticks and we've never failed it and we've done this and our gap analysis is fine, then in my experience they go looking for things because nobody's perfect. If you've got a few failures in there because you didn't do it properly and you recognize that fact, it's going to make your life easier. So that's where something that failing the odd control here or there and really looking into something can actually be a benefit to you. Okay, so that's Sarbanes-Oxley. Has anyone got any other questions about that at the moment? Before we move on to data protection. Data protection is essentially dealing with people's personal data. There's two main tiers of it. You've got the standard personal data that you would use to identify a person. And in the UK as well, you've also got what's classed as sensitive personal data, which is things like trade union membership information, political views, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. Data like that, if you have collected it, you've got to be extra sort of diligent on how you manage it, how you maintain it, and how you protect it, over and above the basic, this is a person X, this is where they live, and these are their date of birth, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to collecting data, you've got to obtain it for specified and lawful purposes. You can't just say, give us your data, and not tell people what you're going to do with it. You collect the data for a specific reason, be it, I want to sell this to the person, and for our records, we need this piece of information, this piece of information, and this piece of information. So that is the information you collect from them. Name, address, credit card information, so on and so forth. Billing address, delivery address, all that information. That's why you're collecting it. And that is something that can be quite useful when you're collecting large data sets as well, if you're looking to do CRM analysis, so on and so forth, about the type of processing that you can actually do as well on that data once you have collected it. It has to be, as I say, adequate and relevant. So if you're trying to collect, if you want to sell someone something, then you don't need to know lots of the information necessarily about things like sexual orientation, political viewpoints, and number of children, all that information. Is it actually relevant to the reason that you need that data? That's something to think about as well. A lot of it's covered in, you go to websites and you'll see the T's and C's for collecting that information. One place I worked, we physically linked, we had the T's and C's and the version control linked into our systems as well, so that when we collected data, we knew which version of the T's and C's that data was collected against as to what we could actually do with that data. Because if you've got data that you've collected over years, you change your T's and C's 3 times, technically, if you've said that we're now going to do this processing on it and that's your latest version, the 2 previous versions you can't actually manipulate or use that data for without gaining authority from the people. You can't just change your T's and C's and say you're all in it now, unless you notify them as well. Something to be fairly and lawfully. So you process it, again, for the reason that you say you're going to process it, and you're not going to get some third party to do weird and wonderful things with their data. You need to make sure it's accurate and up to date as well. So to give you an example, we, as a company, had a very elderly client base, and unfortunately some people would pass away. Making sure that information was up to date and accurate, that they were no longer eligible for receiving mail shots and so on and so forth, was very, very important to us, because there is nothing, it can cause a lot of grief and issues of a sensitive nature if, for example, you send a letter to someone that has passed away, but you've been notified of this and you haven't updated your records. That is something that you need to be very, very careful of. It's something that we encountered at one of the previous employers, and we implemented specific process and protocol around handling and making sure that the data was up to date. You only keep it for as long as you need to, so you don't store it indefinitely forever. Unless, of course, in your T's and C's you say, we're going to retain this for 10 years so that we can do historical trend analysis over whatever. After 10 years, you've got to purge it out your system. So it comes down to your data retention policies, and that's something that not many people manage to do these days. Data retention is a case of, well, we'll keep everything ever just in case. Something to look at. Appropriate measures against unauthorized access and loss. So who can access it? How can they access it? If you send your tapes off to Iron Mountain, are they going in a secure van? They're not going in the back of somebody's car in a duffel bag that they nip into the shop, grab themselves a burger, and then, oh, lo and behold, all your backup tapes are gone with all your customer records. Make sure everything is there. Process in line with the rights of the data subject. This also ties in very well with the not transferred outside of the EU with regards to the UK and European ones, unless you have something like, say, the safe harbour agreement we have with the US in place. So you can't just transfer someone's data out of the political region you're in, which is why if you look at things like Microsoft and the way they've set Azure up, you've got Northern Europe data centres that don't automatically fail over to North America or Asia Pac. So where you've got the data, how it gets there, and how you maintain its integrity within your sort of geopolitical region, and bound by the laws that you're dealing with there. There is, or at least for the UK, there's an organisation called the Information Commissioner, which monitors people's compliance with the Data Protection Act, and they maintain a list of countries and organisations that we have agreements with at a national level that we can actually send data to. So that's something to look at. Now, why me? Data professionals are, and IT in general, are typically responsible for maintaining the data within the business, the security, integrity, the recoverability, where it is, how it's maintained, how it's managed. And you guys know what the limitations are. One of the things is where a lot of these controls are defined by the business is like, we're going to do this. And then it's like, really? That's not technically feasible, or have you thought about maybe looking at doing it a different way, because it would make it easier to implement and reduce our cost overheads and our process overheads that we have with this? So that's where working with the business, or if you're consulting with your customers effectively, and having good communication can really, really make life a lot easier. Again, you don't just want IT to deal with it as well, otherwise you end up with overcomplication, doing things that maybe a little bit the scope's too large, and so on and so forth. You also know the technology, and as I say, what's feasible. We're not going to go and turn C2 auditing or common criteria auditing on SQL Server that's handling hundreds of millions of transactions a day, because unless you've got the system scoped effectively, it's going to fall over. And it can impact the infrastructure and system design that you put together, looking at the way you lay out your VLANs, the way that you lay out your network segments, where you put your firewalls, what you put antivirus onto, how you set up your domain structures and security access, whether or not you set up a DMZ, how you set that up as well. This is all information that you guys know. Do you want to run encryption all the way back to the SQL Server, or do you want to offload it at the front and reduce that issue? Do you want to put your applications behind a web application firewall appliance, or do you want to write something yourself and do it that way? Also, how do you monitor and what do you monitor? All that information is stuff that you guys know more how to do. what can you do? Where possible, I like to use other people's work. That's what Google's there for. Microsoft and the Center for Internet Security have some really, really good best practices and hardening guides, both of which can go a little over the top in places, but saying that you're using somebody else's framework in the way that you've implemented a system, when you document that and your auditors come in potentially, it's something they're likely to have encountered before. And if you're using something that is very close to or an industry standard, de facto or otherwise, it can make your life a lot easier. If they've seen it before, they'll understand it a lot better. You've got less to explain to them, which means that you're more likely to get a better relationship with them, and then you're likely to end up more likely to end up passing your audit. Auditing, logging, and monitoring. There are a number of products and appliances out there, things like Logarithm and so on and so forth, where you just drop an agent on and it will pull everything back to a central server. Splunk is another system. And then you can have large amounts of data coming into a repository for your retention. And then you can set up profiles to say, okay, is this behavior out of band, so on and so forth. Okay, so you can get some alerting out of it as well as being there to do your own analysis on. Logging and monitoring as well also helps if you ever do have the issue where you are breached, in that it gives you a history to help prove that you were compliant and that you were meeting requirements. It also can mean it will show that if you were not, then you're in trouble. But it does aid with a forensic audit when people come in. So making sure you're monitoring and logging the appropriate and pertinent information rather than just everything can be quite important. And our favorite, documentation. Everybody loves documentation. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, but it can get you out of a hole. Documentation can range from simple sort of notepad text files stored on file shares all the way through to full version management through SharePoint. Do what's appropriate for you, but please document things saying, this is our backup process, this is our recovery process, this is our intended RPO and RTO. This is what we do on a monthly basis, so we lag. Where we are at the moment, we've got a process for patching our systems. So we patch every month from Microsoft stuff, but we lag it 20 days. So that a lot of the things like PCI says you'll patch within X number of days, we say, because of historical evidence of Microsoft throwing a duff patch every now and then, we give it 20 days to see what everybody in the industry does and whether or not something blows up. Once we're happy that it's safe, then we do a rolling deployment of patches to our systems. Then we're up to date, in line, ready for the next patching cycle. Some places, another place I work, we ran a one patch Tuesday behind. So when Microsoft came to the next, so Microsoft issued one group of patches, we would wait until the next group came out before we applied the previous batch. Again, just from a due diligence point of view of we don't want to throw a patch out that's going to take systems down. We had an issue with an antivirus system once where they threw a bad update out and we ended up blue screening our entire server estate, which is why antivirus can be interesting. I spent 4 hours on the phone to Verizon telling the guy to turn off PCs that I was sticking the CD trays out of, because our data centers are out in the US and colos. So that's where having an effective process to watch what's gone on the system before, test them, make sure everything's working fine, rather than just having WSUS or whatever set up to automatically deploy patches as soon as you receive them. Speaking of patching, coming down to scope as well, if you've got end user machines in scope on a network segment that you've got as part of, say, PCI, if you get breached through whatever means, but something over here on the user segment was not compliant at that point of view and point of time, and your auditors come in and find that, then it doesn't matter if the breach came in through a different mechanism, you were not compliant because this one little PC over here in a corner somewhere because someone didn't apply some patches. Just remember that, which is where it comes down to making scope. And so this way, setting your documentation up to say that this is what our scope is and this is our process for applying patching or applying updates to SQL Server, or our backup process for taking tapes out of the drive, putting them in a secure box, waiting for Iron Mountain's secure van to show up and handing it to them and getting a signature, so on and so forth. Encrypting and obscuring data. Encryption is wonderful. SQL Server does a lot of different types down to the column level. So various functions you can build into your application to actually encrypt the data in line, so your DBAs can read the data but not read the data, if you see what I mean. Although 2014 does bring along that nice little baked-in feature where they can administer it but not see any data. Really good reason to go to 2014, a really good reason to buy SA, we found out, because we didn't. One thing that encryption does bring with it, though, is key management, which is it can be a very sort of arduous process to make sure your encryption keys and so on and so forth are securely stored. How do you age them out? How do you replace them? So on and so forth. So whilst encryption can seem like a great idea at the time, just be aware that it can add an overhead. TDE is probably one of the lesser of the two evils when it comes to that. You just make sure you got your master certificates backed up, securely stored, so if you've ever got to do restores and so on and so forth, but then all the data is still there, and you've not got to handle encryption in the application and so on and so forth. Like I say, encrypting on the wire is probably the easiest thing. If you've got web apps and so on and so forth, run them over SSL, HTTPS, that sort of stuff. Whether or not you take that all the way back to the database connections as well from the servers in the DMZ and such like, IPsec tunneling, that sort of stuff. There's all sorts of things you can do to encrypt data on the wire. So if you've got network teams that are doing, let's say, deep packet inspection or running things like Wireshark, that they can't see the data inadvertently. Effective data retention policies. Only really store it for as long as you need it. If you've got large volumes of data kicking about somewhere, be it in spreadsheets, in databases, SQL Server access databases are horrendous for it. People, I'll just get an output of this data and I've got access, it comes with Office, I'll just build myself this and off you go. And it's something that's lurking there. Having an effective data control for policies for retention and how you dispose of that data, which comes on to an effective decommissioning and data destruction policy. One of the things that, we buy Dell hardware because when we buy it, there's a little radio button on their website that says we get to keep our hard drives if they fail. We pay you X amount of money, we got our 4-hour response, we'll ring you up, our hard drive's failed, send us a new one, we haven't got to send the old one back. We can then securely make sure it's destroyed. So that's, even when it comes down to buying your hardware, that's something to bear in mind. Either that or you end up buying extra hardware, buying extra hard drives in. When you come to finally decommissioning a system, how do you destroy the data on the drives? We use a freeware application called DBAN, Derek's Boot and Nuke, which does multiple passes of random writes over the data itself. Really, really good for destroying securely the data, but obviously leaving the hard drives there. There are other things as well. So essentially, once you do that, we've got a policy in place that we've got one guy that does all of the work, and then he draws up a certificate that we've got that says, yep, this was securely destroyed, yada, 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 goes into the logbook, and then we can either eBay off the kit or we can send it off to a destruction supplier and so on and so forth. So we can try and recoup some of the money rather than just sending to landfill. But that's something to think about as well. Just coming back to encryption as well is removable devices. There are a number of products as well that handle encryption, either laptops, full disk encryption, things like bcrypt or TrueCrypt. TrueCrypt is a nice free piece of software that will let you also build secure containers for USB drives if you've ever got to transfer data around the business. Encrypt the USB sticks, it's a piece of freeware, you put it into an archive and then you can mount it that way. So there's various different options there as well. Moving on to something that's a little bit softer skills, communication with the business. If the business goes under, your job's gone. So there is that sort of synergy between the technical side of things and the business side of things, and establishing a good relationship, a good working relationship and good communication lines with the business is something I've found is key. Being able to, either yourself or have sort of designated members of the teams that can interface with the business at all levels, all the way up to director level, can really make life easier when you're not only trying to explain why something is feasible and why we should be doing something, but also when it comes to trying to justify effectively why you need to spend some money on a particular monitoring platform. If you've got a good level of communication and a good level of trust that the business knows that you're looking out for them, they will look out for you as well. So communication is, I know it's something we say, but it is something I find is very, very important. Well worth looking at trying to spend the time, so we're going to lunch together in the canteen, going for a coffee and so on and so forth. really can help. It's the little things like that, rather than having meetings and big team building exercises. Just the sort of day-to-day interactions that you have with people can have actually quite a big bearing on how you implement and how you manage your compliance within a business. Keeping the scope as small as possible. This is where segmenting your network topology, putting only specific types of database and data within a SQL Server environment and so on and so forth, can really sort of make life a lot easier. If you've got less to manage, the scope is small, then it's going to make life easier. You've got less overhead, less jobs to do in order to that. Have a look at through your logging systems, your monitoring systems. So I know I don't want to be particularly monitoring 150 servers when actually in reality 3 of them are the ones that I'm really concerned about. So how can I make those 3 only the 3 that I'm really, really interested in? That reduces my monitoring licensing costs. It reduces my workload because I only have to spend the day looking at 3 servers in the morning rather than 150. Little things like that. Like I say, if you can run dedicated network channels and so on and so forth, it does make life a lot easier. Most important of all, common sense. It's not as common as you think. A lot of people say, okay, we're now working to this compliance level, that means everything must be under it, and it's like, no. You only need to look at what you need to do. Understand what you need to do, but also understand what you don't need to do. And say, okay, well, we just need to make sure we've got virus software up to date, or we need to make sure we've got Microsoft patching. Little things like that that you just automatically think, you've got your PC at home set up to do Microsoft updates most of the time. Okay, I set mine up to say, give them to me, but I'll hit the button to say go. You do that at home, it's the type of thing that you want to do on your servers as well. Don't print things out and leave them lying around on the printer. Don't leave USB sticks lying around your desk when you go home. Clear desk policy is quite useful and can be quite good. Clear desk, clear mind is what a lot of people say, but if you've not, if you've got USB sticks that you're transferring data around on, keep them locked away rather than leaving them on your desk. Even if you're in a secure office, there's still other people around. So it's just little things like that. A little bit of common sense can go an awful long way. Has anyone got any questions so far? Want to have a discussion about stuff? No? Cool. I'm really rattling through this quite quickly, actually. One of the big things is documentation and automation. Where you can remove people from the loop, it makes life a lot easier for you. That can be a case of we've automated our daily checks to the point that we've got PowerShell scripts that go around, collate all of the information, and present it in a web page, or we've got SSIS that goes and gathers it into a database and stores which run it was collected from, where everything was, and then we've got reporting services reports over the top that look for stuff that we consider to be out of band. If you can automate things like that collection, then you know that something's not going to get missed. But if it gets missed, it means that it's missed for everything and not just one little server to give you that sort of head-scratching moment of what's going on here, why is my data not correct? So yeah, automate as much as possible. There's so many different options, integration services, PowerShell, batch files, a whole range of third-party tools. All of that sort of stuff is out there. Repeatable processes, like I say, it reduces the chance of a slip-up. It also means that if you bring a new member of staff into your teams, so on and so forth, that you don't have to spend lots of time getting them to read reams of documentation to say, well, you need to go to this server and pull this out, and you need to go here and do this, and you need to go here and do this, and you need to go here and do this. In reality, it's a case of, right, go to this central point, hit this button, wait for it to bring everything in, then look at the report. I'll sit down with you for 3 hours, we'll go through it in detail, and we'll show you what it means. So that takes a lot of it down to there. You've minimized any chances of a slip-up. Another thing I'm very keen to do is, and I know it's very difficult at the moment with budgets for many people, but buying off the shelf where possible, over-rolling your own. There are a number of systems out there. I mean, there's a couple of vendors here that have got some sort of interesting compliant management software offerings on the go. Anything that you can buy off the shelf, auditors are likely to have seen it before. It also means that you've got a case for saying, okay, I bought this package from a vendor, we have a support agreement with said vendor, which means we automatically get updates on a period of time. Whereas if you've written your own system, you've got to try and explain to the auditors what it does. You've got to give them a level of confidence that they know that you've done what you said you've done, and that what you've got is a system that is quite robust, and where you're dealing with things like, say you've written your own system where you've got SQL trace. You're tracking what's going on the server with SQL server-side trace. You're collecting those trace files into a central location. You're then loading them into a database and running reports on top of that. Okay, how do you explain to the auditor that you set your trace up properly? How do you explain to the auditor that you're not going to miss a file? How do you explain to your auditor that the files cannot be tampered with between generation and loading? All that information there. How do you add that information into it as well? How do you then say, well, we monitor the controls on the database that we're loading into so that we'll be able to see if anybody actually goes in and manipulates that data after the fact that it's been loaded? And then also saying, right, well, this is our report definition. Well, we know that the guy hasn't actually written a calculation in or an omission in the queries to look at the database that presents it back to try and hide anything. Okay, a lot of that can be leveled at buying an off-the-shelf product, but when it comes to I've bought an off-the-shelf product, this is what it says on their website, this is what they say, and this is what they're claiming. We have a very warm, fuzzy feeling about this particular vendor. We've spoken with them. We feel they're very sort of strong in the marketplace. That's why we bought it. And then your auditor goes, oh, okay, not a problem. And you can see you've got the support agreement. We know it's going to be updated. We know that it's there, and you've got a defined, again, scope for what that piece of software does. You're not going to try and bolt bits and pieces onto it, much like you'd get potential pressure to do for the business for, well, can you just make it do this as well? Well, can you make it do this as well? If you've got an in-house development team or guys who are actually got high aptitude for building their own scripting systems and so on and so forth, yeah, you can do it, but is it appropriate? I mean, that's one of the things we do. We've got quite a complex, to give you an example, we've got an OLTP system which is currently running at 2 terabytes for its database size because of the volume of data that we're processing on a regular basis. Index maintenance is an absolute nightmare, as is trying to run DBCC and so on and so forth. Do we want to write our own routines? Yada, yada. No, not a chance. Is there any off-the-shelf products that can do it? Yeah, there's a number of vendors that do index management stuff. However, we use Ola's scripts because they're more versatile. We can see what's going on, and we know he looks after them. So that's something as well. I mean, I've used them in many, many places. All the guys that I work with have used them before. It's something that we're very comfortable with and very familiar with as a technology. And they're free, so go to the website, download them, and it makes life a lot easier. And again, you can say this is where we got them from, and this is what's going on. So that's pretty much where we are. I'm running way ahead of schedule because I normally get a lot of questions. It's something that either that or people snoring, and we have to go and give them a nudge. Has anybody got any questions? Yes?
How do you protect yourself from system administrators?
With great difficulty. This is where something like 2014 comes into its own, in that you can allow DBAs access to manage systems without actually giving them access to the data. One of the systems we look at, by the very nature, system administrators need to have a high level of privilege access to the infrastructure. You can segment it as much as you can by saying, well, you're responsible for this particular area, and breaking it up. But ultimately, you're going to still need to give people access to databases. You're still going to need to give people access to file shares. Encryption of data at rest can help with that. One of the systems we looked at is using an off-the-shelf product that does password management. And everybody would operate on their normal user accounts within domain access. But if you needed to log in to perform administrative access, you would go and request the password from the password system. It would generate a random password, reset it for the designated administrator account, at which point you get the password emailed to you. It is active for X period of time that you've requested and that you think you're going to need to do the work. Then when you log out, it resets the password, you can't get back in. In addition to that, there's a very competent endpoint solution from Lumention, which we're looking at evaluating at the moment. I've used it in a couple of areas before when it went under its name of Sanctuary. And what that has the capability of doing, if you look at the Edward Snowden affair where he managed to use removable media to take an awful lot of data off site, something like Lumention can actually track what data was, I mean, you can say, only this white list of hardware serial numbers is permitted to be plugged into the system. So you get that information. You can also then say, everything that gets transferred to removable media, take a copy of it. Understand which serial number, which device, which user was logged in. Log all of this information, so that way in the event of a breach, you know the scope of the breach. But the very nature of system administrators and the privileged rights that they need means it's very, very difficult to say, okay, how do I stop the Lumention administrator whitelisting his own USB stick, plugging it in, taking all the data off, going and selling it to someone, and then changing the system. That's where additional process and procedure and overheads come into it, and that's where there is difficulty, because you want people to be able to do their jobs, but you also want that level of control so that you can't have one person who can compromise an entire platform. None of our system administrators have access to the SQL Server layer. Only our DBAs have access to it. So built-in administrators on the 2005 system, that's straight out, all of that sort of stuff that people can gain access to. And then it's just coming down to effectively monitoring things like Active Directory so that someone doesn't sneak into one of the groups. There are tools out there that can monitor that from various vendors. Again, it comes down to how do you want to do it. There's no perfect system and there's no way to mitigate everything. You just have to sort of do what you can within the bounds of your budget and process constraints and your resources. If we were to try and make a perfect system whereby it was completely secure, you'd be looking at having an IT and infrastructure system that dwarfs the rest of the business that looks after the IT and infrastructure system itself. So it comes down to a little bit of common sense, but also looking and seeing just what's feasible. Sorry if it's a bit of a rambling answer, it didn't give you too much, but yeah, it's one of those things, it's one of those risks that you need to accept. Adopting the mindset of when am I going to get breached rather than if I'm going to get breached. If you understand that at some point in your career you will be involved in a breach of some form, then you'll be better prepared to handle that when it comes along. There'll be less sort of, oh no, what's going on? So, okay, this has happened, I've prepared for this. These are the actions I'm now going to perform in order to make sure I'm covered, but also my team and my business is covered as well. So that's an important mindset, like I say, that I tend to operate on is something I work on is going to get breached at some point by somebody, be it, hopefully it'll be something small and internal, that someone then comes to me, actually I did this. I'm like, okay, right, we can handle this now, rather than some external party ripping out a database of customer details. It's the very nature of the beast. You put anything in the interconnected systems that we have today, there is always going to be that risk that somebody can get in and do something. There is no perfect system. So, anybody got anything else?
You haven't mentioned intrusion detection systems. How important are these SOCs?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. Trying to sort of make sure you don't get false positives and so on and so forth is an interesting one. Where I'm at the moment, we have intrusion detection systems, just off-the-shelf things from Cisco that plug into the network, and we rely on sort of heuristics there. They haven't flagged anything as yet. My personal viewpoint is I've not seen the benefit of them yet. We put a lot of our investment in the front-end securing level, network level firewalls, application level firewalls, a lot of security control, multiple DMZs, that sort of thing, for the way that we bring data in. A lot of the time we work with very large customers that we have the ability to set up point-to-point encrypted connections and come out of them rather than going over the internet and so on and so forth. So, I mean, PCI suggests that you use intrusion detection systems as well, believe it or not. We have, like I say, off-the-shelf Cisco kit that works well. It's not flagged false positives, but then it's also not flagged anything nefarious coming because we've been lucky enough not to have anything. The auditors that we've had seem to be very happy with our configurations.
How can you be certain that you've had
exactly.
breach, if you don't know?
Yeah, I mean, we run monitoring down on our database levels as well. We track every single select statement that hits our database. every insert statement, and so on and so forth. There are products out there as well, one of which we're evaluating, that actually looks at the amount of data going on between the database server and the client applications. And it builds up a profile. So if anything comes out of bounds, so if someone comes in, tries to do a select star and take a huge pile of data out of the database, when normally you're dealing with single atomic sort of transactions with small ones, it will flag it, it will stop it. That's something that we're looking at the moment. So it comes down to defense in depth. There's no one point in the system that can prevent anything or catch everything. It's a case of having to different layers of an onion effectively and say, this is what we've got, this is how it works, and hopefully we'll catch something at some point as it comes in or goes out. It's the nature of the beast. It's just defense in depth is the only thing I can suggest. I mean, like I say, we monitor every select and insert statement, update statement on our database, and it's all going out to a repository. And we're tracking the sort of, we know what our behavior is because with our system, we don't bring new big customers on very often. And they've got very regular patterns of traffic based around what they do. So we just look for out of band as best we can and do spot checks every now and then. So, answered your question at all? Not really, but
You've given me food for thought.
yeah.
I've got a feeling that although you've got to have some sort of intrusion detection within the database itself, you've got to have an external box like a Cisco box
Yeah.
to get to
Yeah, I mean, the IBM Guardian product is something that's very interesting. I think they build it as a database firewall, which is one of the things we're evaluating. Looks quite interesting. It's been around for a number of years. And that's something that will check your data packets, inbound, outbound, looking for the amount of data that's on the wire. So
that's actually looking within the TDS packets itself.
well, it does the packet inspection and says, right, well, no, this is bigger than normal. You can say, stop anything that you think out of band. Okay, it can tank your application if it's a legitimate request that no one's ever done before through the interface. But it's one of those things. It is based around the heuristics and processing. So, anybody? Oh, yeah.
I just want to ask, those tools that you use for auditing or this and so on, is it like standard then that you're, as you say, that you're logging everything, or can you set up filters normally, like, okay, exclude those?
Yeah, you can. We buy an off-the-shelf tool from one of the vendors out there, actually, for our compliance at the database level, and it's very, very tunable to saying, I want these particular applications only, these users only, or exclude these, down to the column level. So if any activity on this column, log it, otherwise forget about it. It uses the server-side trace technology, and it basically checks all the files, it hashes them, checks the hash from the source to the destination before it loads it into its repository, and it's self-checking on its repository as well. And like I say, it's very, very tunable through the interface as to just what you're tracking and how you're tracking it. Well worth having a look at. So, anybody else? Sorry.
Have you had conflicts with people who want to do data mining on the personal information in terms of what's available and how long it's stored?
Yeah, it comes down to, as I say, looking at it and saying, right, what do we collect the T's and C's? What do we collect it against T's and C's? Say, what can we do with this data? And that goes into the contracts and say, this is what we've got. One place I worked, we did a notification to all our customers saying, we're changing them. Do you want to opt in or out of this particular batch of T's and C's as well? It's one of the things you see when people have got spreadsheets historically, and now they're moving to data either things like Hadoop and pulling data into SQL Server for further processing. A lot of the data used to be in spreadsheets, and now they want to load it in. It's like, well, can we actually do that? Should we be doing it? And it just comes down to effectively looking at what your T's and C's were. Can I use this external party? Are they in the right place? Do we have the right agreements with them? How do I get data to them? All of that needs to go into the contracts as well. I mean, we're looking at trying to set up a more comprehensive analytics side to the business at the moment, and trying to find people that we can work with within the bounds that we're dealing with, because it's not our data, it's our customers' data as well, and we want to offer the service to them through the systems and say, well, we've got this relationship with an external party, do you want to use it? So yeah, it can be very, very interesting. So, right, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. Hopefully that's been all right. I know it's a very dry subject, but thank you very much for coming and spending the time listening to me rabble on. I'm going to be floating around all day, so if you do see me and you've got any other further questions, come and give me a shout. Just give me a poke. No problem. Thank you.